She stood beneath the crystal chandeliers while her husband laughed. 10 years of marriage, 200 guests, a ballroom in Manhattan dressed in gold and white. Eric Stephens lifted his glass and called her career a charming little side project. He thanked her for supporting a real businessman. The room responded with polite, careful laughter. Peyton Stephens did not correct him. 7 hours earlier, she had secured a $900 million deal, one that would outsize every project Eric had ever claimed as his own. He humiliated her in public. He just didn't know he was already standing on borrowed ground. If you believe dignity doesn't need to shout, stay with this story until the very end. And before we begin, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is in your city. Stories like this travel across time zones for a reason. If quiet strength matters to you, consider subscribing so you don't miss what happens when the truth finally speaks. At 5:12 that morning, while Manhattan was still washed in the pale blue of unfinished daylight, Peyton Stephens was already awake. She lay still for a moment, listening to the quiet hum of the city 30 floors below. Taxis hissed along damp pavement. Somewhere in the distance, a delivery truck released its brakes with a long metallic sigh. The world was beginning again. Beside her, Eric slept on his back, one arm stretched across the mattress, as if claiming territory even in unconsciousness. His phone rested on the nightstand screen, dark notifications silenced. He had gone to bed late after confirming final details for the anniversary celebration. Floral arrangements, a curated wine list, a videographer. He believed today was about optics. Peyton knew it was about outcomes. She rose without turning on the light. Her movements were precise and economical. A navy suit waited in her closet, pressed the night before. She dressed quietly, fastening pearl studs at her ears. When she passed the bed, Eric stirred but did not wake. He had asked her the previous evening casually, big meeting tomorrow. Just a review, she had replied. That had not been a lie. It simply had not been the whole truth. By 6:03 a.m., she was in the back of a black car moving south along Park Avenue. Her tablet rested on her lap, open to a final draft agreement. The merger between Helix Sara Biotech and Arden Therapeutics had been in negotiation for 14 months. 14 months of redlined clauses, revised projections, regulatory contingencies, and carefully structured earnouts. $900 million. The number itself had never impressed her. What mattered was the structure, how the valuation protected Helixara's research pipeline, how the equity rollover positioned them for expansion, how the intellectual property remained shielded from dilution. She had led every phase. Across from her now sat silence. No congratulatory texts, no social media announcements. She preferred it that way. The car stopped outside Harlan and Pierce LLP at 7:02 a.m. The firm occupied 3 floors of a glass building that reflected the early sun like a blade. Margaret Harlan was already in the conference room when Peyton arrived. Margaret had built a reputation on 2 qualities, discretion and endurance. She was in her early 60s, silver hair pulled into a low knot posture, perfectly straight. "Good morning, Peyton," she said, not rising but meeting her eyes directly. "We're ready." Jonathan Reed, CFO of Arden Therapeutics, stood by the window reviewing printed documents one final time. He nodded respectfully. There were no photographers, no champagne, only signatures. The conference table held 3 copies of the final agreement tabs marking each section. The air smelled faintly of paper and coffee. Outside, traffic intensified. Margaret spoke first. "All compliance contingencies have cleared. Funding allocation schedule is attached in Appendix C. Initial tranche $300 million will be released upon filing confirmation." Peyton nodded once. "And the board vote unanimous?" Jonathan replied. "Your presentation last quarter secured it." Her presentation, not Eric's networking dinners, not his speculative partnerships. The modeling, the risk assessments, the restructuring strategy, all of it had been hers. She took the pen. At 9:17 a.m., Peyton Stephens signed her name. It was a controlled movement, neither dramatic nor hesitant. Ink pressed into fiber. Signature complete. Jonathan signed next. Margaret followed. Margaret closed the final folder and allowed herself the smallest exhale. Congratulations. This will be one of the largest biotech consolidations this year. Peyton did not smile broadly. It will stabilize 3 research programs that would have collapsed otherwise. That was what mattered. Her phone vibrated once against the table. A secure email notification. She did not open it immediately. Margaret leaned forward slightly. Will you be making a public announcement? Not today, Peyton answered. Margaret studied her. You have something else planned. Peyton met her gaze without defensiveness. It's my 10th wedding anniversary. Jonathan laughed lightly. That explains the restraint. It did not, but she let him think so. By 9:26 a.m., the first confirmation email arrived in full. Funding schedule verified. Escrow accounts activated. Legal review complete. $900 million secured. At 9:31 a.m., Eric texted for the first time that day. Don't forget, 7 p.m. sharp. Press coming early. Press. She read the message without expression and typed back, I'll be there. No emoji, no elaboration. From his perspective, the day unfolded predictably. He had breakfast at the Lowell with a potential investor. He discussed expansion into Miami properties. He mentioned more than once that his wife worked in consulting finance side stuff. He liked the way it sounded vague enough to diminish, sophisticated enough to impress. He did not know that by mid-morning, the valuation of his wife's negotiation exceeded the net projection of his entire development portfolio. He did not know because he had never asked detailed questions. When Peyton returned to her own office just before noon, her assistant, Claire Donovan, rose immediately. It's done, Claire asked quietly. Peyton nodded. Claire's eyes widened. That's yes, Peyton said softly. But we don't announce yet. Claire understood. She had worked under Peyton for 5 years. She knew that silence often preceded structural change. Board call at 3, Claire asked. Rescheduled to Monday? Peyton replied. Send revised calendar. Inside her office, glass walls overlooked the East River. She closed the door and finally opened the confirmation email in full. The numbers lined up precisely with projections. No deviations, no hidden contingencies. She forwarded copies to a secure personal archive. Then she opened another folder, one unrelated to Helixara. Bank statements, joint accounts. She had not intended to review them that morning. But success has a way of clarifying peripheral doubts. Scrolling through the past quarter, she noted several transfers she did not immediately recognize. Large, rounded numbers. 6 figures at a time. Silverline Holdings, LLC. She paused. Silverline had appeared before, vaguely. She had assumed it was tied to one of Eric's development subsidiaries. But the amounts were irregular. Not investments, not documented partnership contributions. Withdrawals. She did not react emotionally. She did not confront. She exported the statements. There would be time to examine them carefully later. At 2:48 p.m., another confirmation email arrived. Escrow officially funded. The first $300 million were now allocated. She leaned back in her chair. For 14 months, she had endured late nights, combative negotiations, subtle undermining from competitors who assumed she was merely the visible strategic liaison. She had corrected assumptions quietly, line by line. Eric had attended 2 early dinners during preliminary talks. After that, he had stopped asking. He preferred ventures where applause was immediate. Peyton preferred ventures where stability lasted decades. As evening approached, she returned home to prepare for the anniversary celebration. The apartment was already transformed. Florists had delivered arrangements of white orchids and gold-accented roses. Garment bags hung along the hallway. A stylist waited in the guest room. Eric emerged from his office wearing a tailored tuxedo phone pressed to his ear. Yes, of course, he was saying. 10 years. You know how it is, couldn't have done it without the right support system. He caught sight of Peyton and gave her a quick approving glance, assessing not affectionate. He ended the call. Big turnout tonight. Charles Whitman confirmed last minute. Good exposure. Exposure. For you? She asked mildly. He smirked. For us. But the word felt misapplied. As she changed into a silk gown, Ivory understated her phone vibrated once more. Final compliance clearance. Everything was locked. 7 hours before Eric would stand beneath chandeliers and measure her worth in front of witnesses, Peyton Stephens had already altered the trajectory of an industry. She did not rehearse lines. She did not plan retaliation. She memorized facts, and she carried them with her into the night. Peyton Stephens had learned early that stability was rarely gifted. It was constructed. She was born in Columbus, Ohio, the only child of 2 public school teachers who believed in routine, in ledger-balanced budgets, in never spending what had not yet been earned. Her father taught mathematics. Her mother taught American literature. Their house was modest, clean, and always full of paper-graded exams, library books, notebooks filled with careful handwriting. No one in her childhood had spoken about mergers or valuations. They spoke about responsibility. When Peyton was 16, her father lost a portion of his retirement savings during a market downturn. She remembered the silence at the dinner table more than the numbers themselves. Her mother had reached across and placed her hand over his. No accusation, no panic, just recalibration. That was the first time Peyton understood that money was not power. Information was. She earned a scholarship to Northwestern University, double majoring in economics and data science. She did not attend parties unless invited twice. She studied balance sheets the way other students studied faces. Eric Stephens entered her life during her second year in Chicago after graduation. He was charismatic in a way that suggested motion even when he stood still. Tall, well-dressed, always slightly louder than necessary. He had just launched a small real estate development firm with 2 partners and a line of credit he was certain would multiply quickly. They met at a networking event neither particularly wanted to attend. Eric had approached her after overhearing her dismantle a flawed valuation model in casual conversation. "You're ruthless," he had said, smiling. "I'm precise," she corrected. He liked that about her, at least at first. In those early years, their dynamic felt complementary. He had ambition that filled rooms. She had analysis that stabilized plans. He brought deals to the table. She stress-tested them until they either collapsed or strengthened. It was Peyton who redesigned his first major financing structure, converting short-term variable-rate debt into a longer fixed-term instrument that prevented what would have been a catastrophic cash flow squeeze. Eric had celebrated publicly. Privately, he had thanked her with a bottle of wine and a promise. "We'll build something big," he had said. Together. For a time, they did. But success shifts gravity. When Eric's third development project was featured in a regional business magazine, the interview described him as a visionary, reshaping urban luxury. Peyton's contribution was summarized in one sentence: his wife works in finance. He had not corrected it. At the launch party for that project, Eric introduced her to investors, as the brains behind the spreadsheets delivered with a laugh that invited others to laugh too. She noticed then the subtle adjustment in tone, the shift from admiration to containment. The first time he interrupted her mid-sentence in public, she assumed it was accidental. The second time, she began counting. She never confronted him directly about the small humiliations. Instead, she recorded them. A note in her phone dated April 12th. "Eric corrected me publicly, reacquisition timeline." He was wrong. Another entry 3 months later joked about my-risk paranoia in front of Benton Group. Her leather-bound notebook held similar entries. Dates, context, exact phrasing when possible. Not as ammunition, as data. Eric, for his part, interpreted her quiet as agreement, or submission, or perhaps simply absence of threat. He began to reshape their shared narrative. In interviews, he spoke about the sacrifices required to lead. He described long nights negotiating land permits, managing contractors navigating regulatory hurdles. When asked about work-life balance, he smiled and said, "My wife keeps things steady at home." Peyton had not left her position. She had, in fact, been promoted twice during that period. But Eric's language reframed her achievements as secondary. The imbalance deepened subtly. He started hosting more private dinners without her. Strategic gatherings, he said. Real estate was relationship-driven. She would be bored. She was rarely bored. She was observing. The first serious fracture appeared during Eric's expansion into Miami luxury developments. He sought additional capital and proposed using a portion of their joint investment portfolio as collateral. Peyton reviewed the proposal line by line. The exposure is too concentrated, she told him one evening at their dining table, papers spread neatly between them. If the pre-sales underperform by even 15%, liquidity tightens. He leaned back in his chair, smiling thinly. You're overanalyzing. Risk is part of growth. Risk should be measured, she replied. He signed the documents anyway. The Miami project succeeded barely. Market timing favored him. He attributed the win to instinct. From that point forward, instinct became his preferred justification. Peyton's caution became in his retelling fear. The jokes sharpened. At a charity gala, he introduced her to a hedge fund manager as the reason I double-check my contracts. She reads everything twice. The implication hung in the air, obsessive, meticulous, small-minded. The manager later approached her privately and asked for her opinion on a pending acquisition. Eric did not see that conversation. What Eric saw was applause. What Peyton saw were patterns. By their 8th anniversary, the rhythm of dismissal had solidified. Not dramatic, not explosive, just consistent. She noticed how he positioned himself physically in group settings, slightly ahead of her body, angled outward, as if she were an extension rather than a partner. She noticed how he summarized her work vaguely when speaking to others, reducing complex financial restructurings to corporate advisory stuff. She noticed how he stopped asking detailed questions about her projects. It did not occur to him that her work had outgrown the scale of his. Peyton did not measure worth in comparison. She measured trajectory. In the quiet of their apartment, she often reviewed her notes, not to relive slights, but to confirm they were real. Gaslighting requires ambiguity. Documentation removes it. On one page, she had written simply, "He needs to be the loudest voice in the room." She underlined it once. There had been moments of tenderness, still shared vacations, late-night conversations about books, the comfort of familiarity. Eric was not a caricature of cruelty. He was complex, capable of charm and warmth. But he was also increasingly dependent on hierarchy. And in that hierarchy, he preferred elevation. 7 hours before he would stand in a ballroom and reduce her career to a decorative accessory, Peyton Stephens had already recalibrated the financial future of 2 biotechnology firms. He did not know because he had stopped looking closely. He believed the arc of their marriage bent permanently in his direction. He believed the audience in every room would always tilt toward him. Peyton, meanwhile, continued gathering facts. The small humiliations were no longer emotional injuries. They were indicators, data points. And data, when accumulated long enough, reveals trend lines. On the afternoon of their 10th anniversary, as stylists prepared floral arrangements and event planners confirmed guest lists, Peyton reviewed one more set of numbers in her office. The Helix-Sara merger was secure. Her professional standing was undeniable. What remained uncertain was not her value, but the integrity of the partnership she had once believed in. She closed her laptop and slipped the leather notebook into her bag. 10 years earlier, Eric had promised they would build something big together. They had. But foundations shift when one architect begins rewriting the blueprint alone. By evening, under chandeliers and cameras, the difference between narrative and reality would widen. Peyton would not interrupt him. She would let him speak, because sometimes the clearest evidence is self-delivered. The grand ballroom of the Halcyon Hotel had been transformed into something that resembled a curated memory rather than a room. White orchids cascaded from suspended glass installations. Gold-threaded linens covered round tables arranged with geometric precision. A projection screen stretched across the far wall, currently displaying a slow montage of photographs, engagement portraits, vacation sunsets, Eric breaking ground at construction sites. Eric shaking hands with investors, Eric at podiums. Peyton appeared in the montage too, but often at the edge of frames. Arriving guests were greeted by a string quartet positioned near the entrance. The music was elegant, unobtrusive, calculated not to overpower conversation. Event staff moved with synchronized discretion, refilling champagne flutes before they emptied. Eric had overseen every detail. He stood near the center of the room as guests filtered in his tuxedo, cut sharply against the soft lighting. He embraced men with confident familiarity, clasped shoulders, leaned in close when speaking. With women, he deployed warmth, measured compliments, stories punctuated by controlled laughter. 10 years, he said more than once. Feels like yesterday. He enjoyed repetition when it reinforced narrative. Charles Whitman arrived shortly after 7. Whitman's presence mattered. A veteran investor with influence spanning decades, his attendance alone elevated the event from celebration to strategic gathering. Eric greeted him with visible enthusiasm. "Charles, I'm honored," Eric said, guiding him toward the bar. "Couldn't imagine tonight without you." Whitman's handshake was firm but reserved. His eyes gray and assessing scanned the room. "Where's Peyton? She's finishing up," Eric replied smoothly. "Always polishing something." He meant it as a joke. Whitman did not laugh. Across the ballroom, Peyton entered without announcement. Her ivory silk gown was understated, the lines clean, unembellished. She wore no statement necklace, no dramatic earrings. The effect was quiet, almost architectural. Conversations shifted subtly as she crossed the room. Not because she demanded attention, but because presence sometimes commands it without effort. Laura Benton, partner at a private equity firm, approached first. "Peyton, you look radiant." "Thank you," Laura. Peyton replied, her voice steady. "I'm glad you could come." Laura lowered her tone slightly. "I heard you had an important morning." Peyton's expression did not change. It was productive. Laura studied her, sensing restraint, but not pressing. Eric joined them moments later, sliding an arm around Peyton's waist. The gesture appeared affectionate to observers. His grip tightened slightly when he leaned in to speak. "Laura was just asking about your day," he said, smiling. "I told her it was productive," Peyton answered. Eric chuckled. "She's modest. Meanwhile, I've been fielding calls all afternoon." He released her and pivoted toward another guest, leaving Peyton standing beside Laura. Laura's eyes lingered. "Congratulations," she said quietly. "For what?" Peyton asked. "For whatever you accomplished this morning." Peyton inclined her head, but offered no details. At 7:45 p.m., the ballroom was full. Eric had curated the seating chart carefully. Investors near the front, media along the perimeter, family clustered together in a visible, cohesive unit. Peyton noticed the arrangement immediately. Control, she thought. Spatial hierarchy. She recognized several faces from Eric's recent Miami venture developers who had benefited from his expansion. She also saw 2 journalists from regional business publications. Their cameras were discreet but ready. On the projection screen, the montage transitioned into a video. Eric appeared in interview format, seated in what looked like his office. Soft lighting framed him. A narrator's voice, likely hired, spoke about ambition, resilience, partnership. Peyton watched herself appear briefly, standing beside him at a groundbreaking ceremony. The caption read, "Support System." She did not react outwardly. Inside, she registered the omission. No mention of her role in early financing models. No reference to her own career milestones. The narrative had been streamlined, simplified. Margaret Harlan arrived late, slipping quietly into a seat near the back. Her presence was deliberate. She had declined to RSVP publicly, but had chosen to attend regardless. She watched. At 8:02 p.m., the quartet softened their music and gradually fell silent. A spotlight angled toward the small stage at the front of the room. Eric stepped up first. He adjusted the microphone with easy familiarity, scanning the room, as if confirming ownership. Friends, he began, voice amplified, but warm. Thank you for being here tonight. 10 years ago, Peyton and I started something extraordinary. Applause followed. Peyton stood to the side of the stage, hands loosely clasped. She had not been shown the speech. Eric continued. When we met, I was just beginning my journey in real estate. Big dreams, bigger risks. He smiled. Peyton came along with spreadsheets and caution tape. Laughter rippled gently. He paused for effect. And over the years, I've learned something important. Success requires vision, but it also requires support. He gestured toward Peyton. She's always been there, quietly, steadily, making sure I don't forget the details. More laughter, polite, controlled. Peyton's posture remained unchanged. Eric continued recounting stories of late nights reviewing contracts framed as her double-checking his bold moves. He described her as methodical, careful, protective. Each adjective reduced scale. Charles Whitman shifted slightly in his seat. Laura Benton's smile faded. Eric did not notice. He concluded the speech with a raised glass. To 10 years, to risk, and to the people who make sure we land on our feet. Applause filled the room louder this time, though not entirely uniform. Eric stepped down and extended a hand to Peyton, inviting her to join him center stage. She walked forward without hesitation. The microphone stood between them. He handed it to her with a flourish. Say something. It was both invitation and test. She took the microphone gently. Thank you all for being here. She began, her voice even unhurried. 10 years is a long time. Silence settled more deeply now. Her tone lacked spectacle, which made listeners lean closer. Partnership, she continued, is built on trust, on shared understanding, on clarity. Eric's smile remained fixed. And sometimes she said softly, clarity takes time. She lifted her glass. To honesty. She handed the microphone back. No joke, no embellishment. The applause that followed was uncertain but respectful. Eric leaned in, whispering through clenched teeth. That's it, that's enough, she replied. As guests resumed conversation, subtle currents began to shift. Conversations grew quieter when she passed. Several investors approached her directly, now asking more pointed questions about her work. Eric circulated, attempting to reclaim attention, but something intangible had altered. He sensed it but could not define it. Across the room, Margaret Harlan caught Peyton's eye briefly and gave a small nod. The montage resumed, but it no longer commanded the room in the same way. Eric did not yet understand that narratives once stretched too thin begin to tear. Peyton understood. She stood beside him beneath the chandeliers, aware that the evening was still unfolding, aware that humiliation had not yet reached its full arc. 7 hours earlier, she had signed a document that secured $900 million. Tonight she would sign nothing. She would simply observe. Because sometimes exposure does not arrive through accusation. It arrives through patience. And Eric Stephens, under bright lights and borrowed admiration, was preparing to say more than he realized. The second glass of champagne made Eric looser. Not unsteady, never that, but amplified. His laughter carried farther. His gestures widened. The applause from moments earlier had settled into conversation, and he mistook the lull for hunger. Hunger for more of him. By 8:37 p.m., guests were seated for dinner. Candlelight softened the room, casting long reflections across polished silverware. The string quartet had resumed slower, now atmospheric. Eric tapped his fork lightly against his glass. The sound was delicate, almost polite. But the room obeyed. He stood again, unplanned napkin falling from his lap. Just one more thing, he said, smiling, as if apologizing for brilliance. Peyton remained seated this time. He walked back to the stage without being invited. Margaret Harlan's jaw tightened slightly in the back row. Eric leaned into the microphone. I realized I didn't properly acknowledge something. His tone shifted, more casual, more intimate. When you build something big, you learn who's built for pressure. A few guests nodded reflexively. He glanced toward Peyton. Peyton's always been detail-oriented. A soft chuckle. She thrives in safe environments, controlled variables, predictable outcomes. Another ripple of laughter, less certain now. But real business, he spread his hands. Real business requires instinct. The word landed heavily. Peyton's expression did not change. She's brilliant with numbers, he continued, but not everyone is meant to lead the charge. Some people are better supporting the vision. There it was. Clearer now. Several heads turned toward Peyton, gauging reaction. She adjusted the stem of her water glass slightly, aligning it with the edge of her plate. Charles Whitman's gaze did not leave Eric. Eric leaned further into the microphone, emboldened by his own momentum. And let's be honest, he said lightly. Sometimes ambition looks bigger on paper than it does in practice. The sentence hung in the air. A few guests laughed reflexively. Others did not. Laura Benton lowered her fork. Eric smiled broadly. But that's marriage right, knowing each other's strengths. He raised his glass toward Peyton. To knowing your role. Silence followed. Not complete silence, but dense. Peyton lifted her eyes to meet his. She did not blink. 7 hours earlier at 9:17 a.m., her signature had finalized a merger that would reshape a sector. Funding confirmation had already been processed. Regulatory filings prepared. Analysts drafting forecasts. $900 million. Not projected, secured. Eric had no knowledge of it. He had not asked about her meeting. He had not inquired about details. He had assumed scale. He mistook quiet for smallness. Peyton rose slowly from her chair. The movement was neither dramatic nor delayed. She walked toward the stage again, not hurried, not reluctant. The room watched. Eric stepped aside, still smiling, assuming partnership in performance. She accepted the microphone. Her voice, when it came, was calm. "Thank you," she said. 2 words, measured. "I appreciate honesty," she continued. Her eyes moved briefly across the room. Charles Whitman, Laura Benton, Margaret Harlan. Witnesses. Clarity, she said softly, is valuable. She paused. And roles, she added, tend to evolve. A few guests shifted in their seats. She did not elaborate. She handed the microphone back to Eric. No accusation, no correction, no revelation. Only space. Eric laughed lightly, as if she had made a clever joke. "See," he said to the room, always composed. Applause returned thinner than before. Dinner resumed. But the temperature had changed. Conversations at tables were quieter, more analytical. Charles Whitman leaned toward Laura Benton. Has Eric always spoken like that? Laura's lips pressed into a straight line. Not this directly. At another table, 2 junior investors exchanged glances. That felt unnecessary, one whispered. Peyton returned to her seat and resumed eating. Her posture remained upright, her breathing steady. Inside, she catalogued. Public belittlement, recorded by multiple cameras, in front of investors, in front of press. She did not feel humiliation in the traditional sense. What she felt was confirmation of trajectory. Eric, meanwhile, believed he had reasserted dominance. He circulated again, laughing louder than necessary, clapping men on the back, recounting early struggles exaggerated for effect. He did not notice the way several guests now directed questions toward Peyton instead. "What are you working on these days?" Charles Whitman asked her quietly between courses. "Healthcare infrastructure," she replied. "Expanding, yes." How aggressively! She held his gaze. Appropriately. He studied her a moment longer than polite society required. Eric rejoined them, inserting himself into the conversation. "Peyton likes her slow plays," he said. "I prefer speed." Whitman nodded slowly. Speed without structure can be expensive. Eric laughed, missing the nuance. "Only if you're afraid." Peyton took a sip of water. She did not defend. She did not counter, because the truth had already begun moving beneath the surface. By 9:22 p.m., dessert was served. A 3-tiered anniversary cake stood near the stage, gold lettering spelling 10 years. Eric insisted on another photograph session. Flashbulbs flickered. He wrapped an arm around Peyton again, pulling her closer for effect. "Smile," he murmured. She did. The smile was small but real. Not for him, for the future. As they cut the cake, applause echoed again, but something in it felt ceremonial rather than celebratory. Margaret Harlan slipped out quietly before the final toast. She had seen enough. Outside, Manhattan pulsed with indifferent rhythm. Taxis, sirens, late-night pedestrians. Inside, Eric raised one final glass. "To the next decade," he declared. Peyton lifted hers as well. "To clarity," she repeated. The word unsettled him slightly this time. Later, as guests began to depart, several paused to shake Peyton's hand directly. "Impressive composure," Laura Benton said quietly. "Thank you," Peyton replied. Charles Whitman's handshake lingered. "We should talk soon," he said. "I'd like that," she answered. Eric noticed the shift now, not overt, not dramatic, but tangible. The room no longer orbited him exclusively. He felt it as irritation. He would later interpret it as temporary. By 10:41 p.m., the ballroom emptied. Staff dismantled floral arrangements. Candles were extinguished one by one. Eric stood near the entrance, flushed with wine and self-satisfaction. "Well," he said as they stepped into the elevator alone, "that went well." Peyton met her reflection in the mirrored wall. "Yes," she said quietly. "It did. Because humiliation is loud, but documentation is patient." And tonight, Eric Stephens had documented himself. 7 hours earlier, Peyton Stephens had secured $900 million. Tonight, she secured something else. Proof. The elevator doors closed with a soft, insulated hush. Mirrors surrounded them on 3 sides, multiplying their reflections into a narrow corridor of repetition. Eric, in black tuxedo, shoulders back, jaw relaxed in post-celebration satisfaction. Peyton, in ivory silk posture, composed gaze steady. 30 floors down to the lobby. Neither spoke at first. Eric adjusted his cufflinks, studying himself in the reflection. "Strong turnout," he said finally. Whitman looked impressed. Peyton watched the floor numbers descend. He looked observant. Eric smirked faintly. "Same thing." The doors opened to the lobby's marble expanse. A few lingering guests waved as they passed. Outside, a car waited at the curb, engine idling. Inside the vehicle, silence resumed. Eric scrolled through his phone, reviewing tagged photos already appearing on social media. A short clip of his speech had been posted by one of the business reporters. The caption read, "10 years of leadership and loyalty." He smiled. Peyton's phone vibrated once. She did not check it immediately. The city lights blurred against the window as they crossed Midtown. Neon reflections fractured across glass towers. Somewhere downtown, trading desks were preparing for international markets to open. Momentum never paused in New York. When they reached the apartment, Eric stepped inside first, loosening his bow tie. "Good night," he said casually, heading toward his office instead of the bedroom. "I've got early calls." He did not ask how she felt. He did not apologize. He did not recognize the fracture widening beneath the surface. Peyton remained in the foyer for a moment after the door closed. The apartment was immaculate, clean lines, neutral tones, art selected more for prestige than sentiment. From the windows, the Hudson reflected scattered city lights. She removed her heels and placed them neatly beside the console table. Only then did she unlock her phone. 2 new emails. The first escrow confirmation finalized. The second transfer notification. The initial tranche, $300 million, had been allocated precisely as structured earlier that morning. She opened the attached documentation, carefully reviewing line by line. Everything aligned. Everything held. She forwarded copies to her encrypted personal archive. Then she opened the banking application linked to their joint accounts. Not impulsively, methodically. The interface loaded. Balances appeared. Scrolling backward through recent transactions, she focused on patterns rather than isolated entries. There, Silverline Holdings, LLC. She tapped the transaction details. $250,000. Date 6 weeks ago. Another transfer. $400,000. then 3 more within the past quarter. Each routed from a joint investment account originally seeded with her bonus distributions. She did not react outwardly. She opened the business registry database. Silverline Holdings LLC was registered in Delaware. Owner listed Ryan Stephens, Eric's cousin. She leaned back slightly on the edge of the sofa. The amounts were not catastrophic relative to total assets, but they were deliberate, layered, and undocumented in any shared planning conversation. She exported 12 months of statements, then 18, then 24. Patterns intensified. Over $3 million transferred through Silverline over 2 years. Some of the capital had originated from an investment pool. Peyton had personally structured one, tied to early-stage healthcare ventures. That detail altered the analysis. This was not discretionary spending. It was fiduciary exposure. From his office down the hallway, Eric's voice rose faintly during a phone call. He was laughing again. She closed the banking app and walked quietly to her study. A leather-bound notebook rested in the top drawer of her desk. She opened it to a blank page. Date, time, transaction summary, no commentary, just facts. Her phone vibrated again. A message from Claire Donovan. Board congratulates you privately. Word will circulate Monday. Incredible work. Peyton typed back, thank you. Keep internal. Silence resumed. At 11:42 p.m., she opened her laptop and logged into the joint account from a secure desktop portal. She downloaded complete PDF statements for the past 24 months and stored them on an encrypted external drive. Documentation required redundancy. In the hallway, Eric's office door opened. Footsteps approached. He entered the living room, holding a glass of whiskey. You still working? He asked lightly. Reviewing numbers, she replied. He leaned against the door frame. Even tonight, yes. He smiled faintly. You never stop. She met his gaze calmly. Neither do you. He raised his glass slightly, as if acknowledging parody, though he did not fully understand it. You handled yourself well tonight, he said after a moment. Didn't take it personally. She closed her laptop halfway. Why would I? He shrugged. Some people are sensitive. I prefer clarity, she answered. He nodded, apparently satisfied. Get some sleep, he said, turning back down the hallway. The door to his office shut again. Peyton reopened the laptop. Silverline's transfers were structured in irregular intervals, avoiding detection through uniform scheduling. That suggested intentional design. She opened another browser tab and searched corporate filings linked to Ryan Stephens. Silverline held minority stakes in 2 small development entities, both connected indirectly to Eric's Miami expansion. The exposure, if traced, could raise compliance questions, especially if originating capital included funds from structured investment vehicles tied to Peyton's firm. Her breathing remained even. Emotion would distort analysis. She extracted transaction IDs and compiled a summary spreadsheet. Amount, date, source account, destination, associated entity, by 12:36 a.m. The outline of a pattern was undeniable. This was not oversight. It was strategy, and strategy leaves signatures. She closed the laptop again and carried the external drive to a locked drawer in her desk. From the hallway, no sound. Eric had likely gone to bed. She walked to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and stood for a moment facing the window. 7 hours earlier, she had secured $900 million. Tonight, she had identified $3 million quietly rerouted without disclosure. Scale did not diminish significance. Integrity did not operate proportionally to size. She thought of the speech, to knowing your role. She replayed the exact phrasing in her mind. Language reveals belief. Belief predicts behavior. At 12:58 a.m., she sent a single email from her private account. To David Klein. Subject consultation. Discretion required. Body need review of financial irregularities. Availability tomorrow. She closed the laptop completely. No confrontation, no raised voice, no accusation across bedroom walls. Just documentation. Just sequence. Just preparation. When she finally entered the bedroom, Eric was asleep, turned towards her side of the bed, as if instinctively claiming space. She lay down beside him without touching him. In the darkness, Manhattan continued moving markets, opening overseas algorithms, trading contracts being signed in other time zones. Eric believed tonight had reinforced his position. He believed humiliation delivered publicly would settle quietly. He did not know that documentation had already begun. He did not know that silence was not surrender. It was evidence gathering. And evidence once assembled does not require spectacle. It requires timing. David Klein did not ask unnecessary questions over email. At 7:14 a.m., Peyton received his reply. Available 10:30. In-person preferred. Bring documentation. No exclamation point. No speculation. She appreciated that. Eric left the apartment before 8, dressed in a charcoal suit, already on a call as he stepped into the hallway. Yeah, it played well, he was saying. Positioning matters. He did not glance back. Peyton waited until the door clicked shut before opening her study drawer. The encrypted drive felt cool in her hand. She dressed in a slate gray suit, structured minimal, and left the apartment without alerting Eric. David Klein's office was located on the Upper East Side, inside a pre-war building that suggested permanence rather than trend. His firm specialized in corporate litigation and fiduciary disputes. Discretion was embedded in the walls. He greeted her in a conference room with heavy oak panels and a long rectangular table. David was in his mid-40s, measured in speech, unremarkable in appearance by design. His power lay in detail retention. You mentioned irregularities, he began once the door was closed. Peyton placed the external drive on the table. I'd like you to review 24 months of joint account activity, she said. Specifically transfers to an entity called Silverline Holdings, LLC. David inserted the drive into his laptop and began scanning files. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was analytical. He opened the compiled spreadsheet first. You prepared this? He asked. Yes. His eyes moved line by line. 3.2 million routed over 2 years, he murmured. Intermittent pattern. Avoids automated red flags. Yes. Source accounts include your structured investment pool, yes? He leaned back slightly. Was this authorized? No, documented, no. David folded his hands. This constitutes potential breach of fiduciary duty, he said carefully, especially if investment vehicles under your management were indirectly exposed. She nodded once. I have not confronted him, she added. That's wise. He continued reviewing. Silverline is registered under Ryan Stephens, he said. Your husband's cousin? Yes. Have you confirmed beneficial ownership beyond public registry? Not yet. He closed the laptop halfway. Before any confrontation, we need full mapping. Beneficial ownership, corporate layering, cross-reference with your firm's capital sources. She listened, without interrupting. If these funds originated from accounts tied to your professional role, David continued, there are implications beyond marital dispute. Regulatory exposure? Board liability. I understand. Do you want this contained within divorce proceedings, he asked, or escalated? The question was neutral. Peyton considered it for exactly 3 seconds. I want accuracy first, she said. David nodded. That requires subpoena authority eventually. But for now we gather. He reopened the laptop and began exporting raw transaction logs. Has he displayed other patterns of concealment? David asked. Not financially documented, she replied. But strategically, yes. He glanced up briefly, registering the phrasing. This is not emotional, he observed. No, it wasn't. Emotion had already been filtered out. By 11:18 a.m., David had compiled an initial legal assessment. I recommend immediate preservation measures, he said. No alerts, no account freezes yet. We build complete evidentiary chain. She agreed. Second, he continued, we review your prenuptial agreement in full. She slid another folder across the table. He skimmed key clauses. Strong, he murmured. Very strong. Her intellectual property rights were insulated. Any undisclosed diversion of joint investment funds triggered protective clauses in her favor. He likely never anticipated enforcement, David said. He rarely reads beyond summary, she replied. David's mouth curved slightly at that. We proceed quietly, he concluded. I'll initiate deeper forensic review. You maintain normal behavior. I will. As she left the office, Manhattan felt unchanged. Traffic, pedestrians, street vendors setting up carts. Yet internally architecture was shifting. Back at her own firm, Peyton moved through meetings as scheduled. No one outside her immediate team knew about the bank irregularities. Claire entered her office mid-afternoon. Monday's board call agenda confirmed, she said. And Charles Whitman requested a private discussion later this week. Schedule it, Peyton replied. Claire hesitated. Everything okay? She asked gently. Yes, Peyton said. It was not a lie. Okay was relative. That evening, Eric returned home unusually energized. Miami expansion's gaining momentum, he said, loosening his tie. Investors loved last night. Peyton observed him from the kitchen counter. Did they? She asked. Of course. He poured himself a drink. You saw it. She had seen something, just not what he believed. By the way, he added casually, Ryan's launching a new holding structure. Might route some liquidity through it. Tax efficiency, silver line. Her gaze remained steady. Has that already happened? She asked. He paused only a fraction too long. Some preliminary transfers, he said. Nothing significant. How significant? He shrugged. Routine. She filed the word away. Are you comfortable with that? She asked mildly. Of course, he replied, slightly defensive now. It's family. She did not challenge. She did not mention figures. Just keep me informed, she said. He nodded, apparently satisfied that the inquiry had been superficial. That night, once he slept, she reviewed additional files David had emailed. Preliminary tracing indicated that portions of Silverline's funds had been re-injected into Miami property developments, effectively shielding risk under a separate entity. If those projects underperformed, liability could cascade, not just onto Eric, onto shared capital. She drafted another note in her leather notebook. Verbal admission, preliminary transfers. Date. Documentation transforms conversation into evidence. 2 days later, David called. Confirmed, he said without preamble. Silverline's beneficial control traces back to Eric through layered voting rights. She closed her office door. An exposure reel, he replied. Not catastrophic yet, but escalating. Options: we prepare protective filing. Quietly. You maintain position until timing favors disclosure. Timing. She thought of the ballroom, of microphones, of knowing your role. Eric believed momentum was his. He believed liquidity equaled dominance. He did not understand compliance architecture. He did not understand documentation trails. And he did not understand that Peyton Stephens never moved without sequence. That evening, she stood alone by the apartment window. Below the Hudson reflected fractured light. $3.2 million had been diverted. $900 million had been secured. Numbers alone did not define outcome. Alignment did. Eric entered the room behind her. You've been quiet, he said. I've been working, she replied. He stepped closer, mistaking proximity for intimacy. We're on the verge of something big, he said confidently. She turned to face him. Yes, she agreed. He smiled, believing affirmation had been mutual. It was, just not in the way he imagined. Because what was building now was not merely financial restructuring, it was legal positioning. And legal positioning, once finalized, does not require volume. It requires proof. The email from Melissa Grant arrived at 6:42 a.m. on a Thursday. Subject line: You deserve to hear this. No greeting, no signature beyond her name. Melissa had worked as Eric's executive assistant for 3 years before resigning abruptly 8 months earlier. Officially, she had pursued another opportunity. Unofficially, she had left without farewell drinks or LinkedIn endorsements. Peyton had noticed. She opened the email carefully. I hesitated for months, it began. But after the anniversary event, I think you need context. Attached is an audio file recorded during a strategy meeting in Eric's office last spring. I was asked to transcribe it. I kept a copy. Attached one audio file, 12 minutes, 37 seconds. Peyton did not press play immediately. Instead, she forwarded the email to a secure archive and saved the attachment onto her encrypted drive. Then she closed her office door. When she finally pressed play, the room filled with a familiar voice, Eric's. The recording began mid-conversation. The faint clink of glass suggested drinks had been served. "She's useful," Eric was saying. "Don't get me wrong. Peyton gives credibility. Investors trust her. That's leverage." A second voicemail, indistinct, laughed lightly. But she doesn't think big," Eric continued. "She thinks safe. We can't scale if we're constantly hedging." Peyton listened without changing posture. Paper rustled on the recording. "I've structured Silverline precisely so capital can move without her overanalyzing every transfer," Eric said. "Once Miami stabilizes, we phase her out of board influence. Gradual, clean," the second voice asked. "She won't fight," Eric exhaled, amused. "She avoids confrontation. That's her weakness. Silence in the present office." On the recording, someone poured another drink. "She's the face we need until we don't," Eric finished. The audio ended. Peyton replayed it once more. Not for shock, for clarity. Tone, timing, confidence. There had been no coercion in his voice, no frustration, only calculation. She removed her headphones and sat still for several seconds. Not in grief, in alignment. The narrative was now complete. Financial diversion, strategic marginalization, public diminishment, private intent. She picked up her phone and dialed David Klein. "I've received audio documentation," she said when he answered. "Source: former assistant, voluntary, intent to conceal capital transfers, intent to remove board influence." David was silent for 2 seconds. "Send it," he said. Within minutes, the encrypted file transferred. At 9:15 a.m., David called back. "This changes posture," he said. "Intent is now documented." "Yes. With this, protective filing escalates from precaution to necessity." "I understand." "Have you confronted him? Number good." David's tone shifted slightly. "You remain composed under this, yes?" He did not question further. Composure was not denial. It was discipline. Later that afternoon, Peyton requested a meeting with Margaret Harlan under the pretext of reviewing compliance updates on the Helix-Sara merger. Margaret closed her office door once Peyton was seated. "You look certain," Margaret observed. "I am," Peyton replied. She summarized the financial transfers without dramatics. Then she described the audio recording. Margaret's expression did not change, but her eyes sharpened. "He underestimated you," she said finally. "Yes." Margaret folded her hands. "If capital from your structured fund was indirectly diverted," she said carefully, "we have fiduciary implications." "I've retained David Klein," Peyton replied. Margaret nodded once. Good. There was no sympathy in the room, only alignment. "Do you wish to disclose to the board immediately?" Margaret asked. "Not yet." Margaret studied her. "Timing?" she asked. "Yes." Margaret leaned back slightly. "Then we prepare," she said. That evening, Peyton returned home earlier than usual. Eric was in the living room reviewing architectural renderings on his tablet. "Early day?" he asked casually. "Productive," she replied. He did not look up. "Miami's gaining traction," he said. "Ryan's working through Silverline logistics." There it was again. Silverline. She walked into the kitchen and poured herself water. "Be careful with routing," she said mildly. "Complex structures attract scrutiny." He laughed lightly. "You worry too much." "I analyze," she corrected. He glanced up, then faint irritation crossing his face. "It's under control." Control. She considered the word. "Good," she said. Later, when he stepped into the shower, she opened her notebook. Audio confirmation, intent to phase out board influence. Date, no adjectives. Just fact. The following morning, David sent draft language for an initial sealed filing grounds breach of fiduciary duty concealment of marital assets exposure of shared investment capital. She reviewed every clause personally. At 11:32 a.m., she replied, "Proceed." The legal machine began turning, not loudly, not publicly, but definitively. Meanwhile, Eric scheduled a strategy dinner with 2 Miami investors at the apartment the following week. "Optics matter," he said. "They need to see stability." "Stability." Peyton agreed to host. She would not alter pattern prematurely. On Saturday afternoon, she sat alone in her study and replayed the audio once more. She avoids confrontation. That's her weakness. She paused the recording. Avoidance is not weakness, she thought. Premature reaction is. Eric believed silence equaled surrender. He believed documentation was unnecessary if charisma sufficed. He had built Silverline as insulation. He had built narrative as shield. But documentation pierces both. That night, as they prepared for bed, Eric wrapped an arm around her waist. "You've been distant," he said softly. "I've been thinking," she replied. "About what scale?" He smiled faintly in the dark. "You're finally seeing it my way." "No," she thought. "I'm seeing it clearly." He slept easily. She did not from distress, from calculation. The audio file rested in encrypted storage. 3 million documented, 900 million secured, intent captured, evidence layered. Eric had assumed she would never fight. He had assumed she preferred quiet compliance. He had mistaken composure for passivity. In the morning, filings would move from draft to court. He would not know until timing required it, because sometimes exposure does not erupt. It unfolds. And when it does, the person who spoke the loudest rarely controls the ending. The prenuptial agreement had been signed in a glass-walled office overlooking Lake Michigan 10 years earlier. Eric had skimmed it. Peyton had studied it. Back then, the document had felt procedural, an acknowledgement that 2 ambitious professionals were entering marriage with independent assets and distinct trajectories. It had not been drafted in anticipation of betrayal. It had been drafted in anticipation of growth. Now growth had clarified its purpose. David Klein requested a full review in person. The conference room felt smaller this time, not physically, but conceptually. The stakes were no longer theoretical. David placed the prenuptial agreement between them, annotated with color-coded tabs. "I've cross-referenced this with the financial data," he began. "You negotiated strong protective clauses." "I insisted on clarity," Peyton replied. David nodded. Clause 4.2. All intellectual property, proprietary financial models, and structured investment frameworks developed independently by either party remain separate property. She remembered that negotiation. Eric had laughed at the language, calling it overkill. He had been focused on real estate assets. She had been focused on architecture of capital. David continued, Clause 6.7. In the event of undisclosed diversion of marital investment funds exceeding $500,000, the non-diverting party retains the right to immediate asset protection and accelerated review. $3.2 million exceeded that threshold 6 times over. Clause 7.3. David added, tapping the page. Intentional concealment triggers indemnification provisions. She leaned back slightly. Define concealment, she said. Failure to disclose transfers from joint accounts tied to shared investment vehicles, David replied, especially when layered through shell entities. Silverline. David slid another document forward. Forensic tracing confirms beneficial control of Silverline Holdings roots back to Eric through voting rights agreements with Ryan Stephens. Indirect ownership, she said. Yes, David confirmed. But traceable. He paused before continuing. The audio recording strengthens intent. Without it, this would be a financial dispute. With it, it becomes structured concealment. She absorbed that without visible reaction. Next steps, she asked. We file for dissolution under seal, David said. Simultaneously initiate protective financial measures. Quietly notify institutions to monitor suspicious activity. No public filing yet. Not until timing aligns with your professional interests. Professional interests. The Helix-Sara merger was scheduled for formal public announcement Monday morning. $900 million. She would not allow personal collapse to destabilize corporate structure. File Monday afternoon, she said. David studied her. You want the announcement secure first? Yes. He nodded once. You remain controlled, he observed. Control is preparation, she replied. He did not disagree. Later that afternoon, Peyton returned to her office for a final review of merger communications. Press releases were drafted. Regulatory notifications aligned. Internal memos scheduled for distribution at 9:00 a.m. sharp. Claire entered with a printed briefing. Everything ready, she said. Board unanimous. Peyton reviewed the language. Remove the phrase aggressive expansion, she said. Replace with measured integration. Claire smiled faintly. Of course. Measured. That word mattered. That evening, Eric hosted 2 Miami investors in their apartment. The dining table was set meticulously, crystal glasses, linen napkins, curated wine. Peyton participated gracefully. She asked thoughtful questions about zoning approvals, construction timelines, projected absorption rates. One investor, a man named Daniel Price, turned to her midway through the meal. You're quiet tonight, he observed. I'm listening, she replied. Eric laughed. She listens so she can tell me what I did wrong later. Price chuckled politely. Peyton did not contradict. Instead, she asked, what contingency have you built in if pre-sales fall below projection? Eric waved a hand dismissively. They won't. Price's smile thinned slightly. Market volatility's unpredictable. Peyton continued calmly. Liquidity buffers matter. Eric leaned back in his chair. We're not running a hedge fund, he said lightly. No, she agreed. You're running leverage. The room grew still for half a second. Eric forced a laugh. See what I mean? Dinner resumed. But the investors' questions shifted subtly, directed more toward Peyton, more technical, more precise. Eric noticed. He interpreted it as curiosity. He did not yet interpret it as recalibration. After the guests left, he closed the door and turned toward her. You don't have to cross-examine my partners, he said. I asked standard questions, she replied. You implied instability. I implied preparation. He exhaled sharply. You always assume worst-case scenarios. Yes, she said evenly. That's why they rarely surprise me. He shook his head and walked toward the kitchen. Relax, he muttered. Everything's under control. Control again. The word had become reflexive for him. That night after he slept, Peyton drafted a final summary for David investor dinner, no disclosure of silver-line layering, continued minimization of exposure risk, verbal confirmation of control assumption, documentation transformed patterns into structure. Monday morning arrived clear and cold. At 8:58 a.m. Peyton sat in the boardroom at Helixara headquarters. Margaret Harlan sat across from her. Charles Whitman joined via secure video. At precisely 9:00 a.m., the public announcement went live. Headlines populated financial news feeds within minutes. Helixara and Arden Therapeutics finalized $900 million strategic merger. Her name appeared in multiple subheadings. Chief strategist Peyton Stephens led negotiations. Phones vibrated across the table. Emails surged. Charles Whitman smiled through the screen. Congratulations, he said. Peyton inclined her head. Thank you. At 9:17 a.m., exactly 1 week after she had signed the agreement, her phone vibrated again. This time, it was a news alert forwarded by Laura Benton. Market reacting positively. Stock up 12%. Measured integration. By 12:30 p.m. Interviews were scheduled. Press statements queued. At 1:14 p.m., David Klein filed the sealed petition for dissolution of marriage and asset protection. The filing included financial documentation, forensic tracing summaries, and reference to recorded evidence of intent. Eric was in a meeting when his legal notification arrived at 2:03 p.m. He stared at his phone longer than necessary. He read the subject line twice. Notice of filing. His jaw tightened. Control, he realized, was no longer unilateral. Across the city, Peyton concluded a press call. When asked about leadership, she responded simply, leadership is accountability. To numbers, to people, to truth. She did not mention Eric. She did not mention Silverline. She did not mention betrayal. But in a Manhattan office building 12 blocks away, Eric sat motionless, the illusion of structural dominance, dissolving line by line, in a legal document he had never expected to see. He had believed the prenuptial agreement was ceremonial. He had believed silence was compliance. He had believed leverage operated only in markets. He had not understood that contracts like reputations hold memory. And memory, once activated, does not forget. Eric read the legal notice 3 times before it began to feel real. The subject line alone seemed procedural, almost administrative. But the body of the email, concise, formal, irreversible, carried weight. Petition for dissolution of marriage. Motion for immediate asset protection. He closed his office door before reading further. Outside, his assistant was coordinating a conference call about Miami permitting approvals. Inside, the temperature seemed to shift. He scrolled, language precise, filing under seal, allegations of undisclosed diversion of marital funds, request for temporary financial restraints pending review, attached confirmation of court receipt, no accusation in emotional terms, no dramatic phrasing, just structure. He called Peyton immediately. The call went to voicemail. He tried again. Voicemail. He stared at the screen, disbelief hardening into anger. Across town, Peyton was finishing a recorded interview with a financial news network. Miss Stephens, the interviewer, asked what differentiates this merger from others. In the sector discipline, she replied. Growth without structural clarity eventually collapses. We prioritized durability. She ended the call at 2:21 p.m. Her phone displayed 3 missed calls from Eric. She did not return them immediately. Instead, she forwarded the final signed press transcript to Margaret Harlan and then closed her office door. At 2:32 p.m., her phone rang again. She answered this time. What is this? Eric demanded, skipping greeting. A legal filing, she replied calmly. For divorce? His voice tightened. Asset protection. Yes. There was a brief silence, heavy and stunned. You blindsided me, he said. No, she answered. I documented. He exhaled sharply. This is about the anniversary. You're overreacting. It's about Silverline, she said evenly. Silence again. You had no right to dig through accounts without asking, he snapped. They are joint accounts, she replied. And some funds originated from structures under my professional oversight. His tone shifted, searching for control. Ryan's company is legitimate. It's strategic. It is undisclosed, she corrected. That's not the same thing. It is in this context. He paced in his office, glancing at the closed door, as if walls might overhear. You could have talked to me, he said. I did, she replied. I asked about routing. That wasn't... He stopped himself. You're blowing this out of proportion. The transfers exceed $3 million, she said, with documented intent. He froze. Intent, he repeated carefully. Yes. Her voice did not rise. You're recording me now, he accused suddenly. No, she replied. But someone else did. The silence that followed was longer. His breathing changed sharper, faster. Melissa, he muttered. Yes. He swore under his breath. She violated confidentiality. You violated fiduciary duty, Peyton said quietly. The words were not delivered as insult. They were classification. You don't understand the strategy, he insisted. I understand leverage structures, she replied. I design them for a living. He tried another angle. This will destroy both of us publicly. The filing is sealed, she said. For now. For now, he repeated. Timing depends on cooperation. He stopped pacing. You're threatening me. I'm offering sequence, she replied. He struggled to recalibrate. This is about control, he said finally. You couldn't stand that I was leading. She allowed a brief pause before answering. This is about accountability. He laughed once, short, brittle. You think you're so rational. I am, she said. That more than anything unsettled him. Because anger he could counter. Emotion he could manipulate. But calm documentation left little space for narrative reversal. What do you want, he asked. Full financial disclosure, she said. Immediate suspension of additional transfers. Cooperation with forensic review. And if I refuse, the motion proceeds. He swallowed. You'd ruin everything. I would protect what I built. The distinction hung between them. He had built developments. She had built frameworks. At 2:49 p.m., he ended the call without goodbye. In his office, he opened Silverline's internal dashboard. 2 pending transfers awaited authorization. He hesitated. For the first time since constructing the layered entity, he felt the fragility of its design. Across the city, Peyton forwarded the call summary to David Klein. Spoke, denial. Acknowledged Melissa implicitly. David replied within minutes. Documented. Continue non-confrontational posture. Court hearing for temporary restraints scheduled Thursday. Thursday, 48 hours. At 4:00 p.m., Eric's assistant entered his office cautiously. Everything okay, she asked. Fine, he said sharply. Reschedule Miami call. She nodded and retreated. He stared at the architectural renderings on his desk. They suddenly looked abstract, over-leveraged, dependent on continuous capital flow. At 6:12 p.m., he returned home earlier than usual. Peyton was seated at the dining table, reviewing documents. You moved fast, he said without preamble. I prepared, she replied. He sat opposite her. This doesn't have to escalate, he said. It already has. He leaned forward. I can transfer funds back. That addresses liquidity, she said. Not intent. He clenched his jaw. You're weaponizing technicalities. No, she answered. I'm enforcing agreements. He exhaled slowly. I underestimated how far you'd go. Yes, she said. No malice, just fact. For a moment, neither spoke. The apartment felt larger than usual distance measurable. You think you're winning, he said quietly. This isn't competition, she replied. Then what is it? Correction. He stood abruptly, chair scraping against hardwood. You're going to regret this. She did not flinch. Regret comes from ignoring warning signs, she said. I don't. He left the room. She remained seated. Outside, the Hudson reflected early evening light. In 2 days, a judge would review documentation neither of them could rewrite. $900 million secured her professional standing. $3 million documented secured her legal position. But this was not about scale. It was about integrity. Eric had believed humiliation carried no cost. He had believed concealment would remain invisible. He had believed she would avoid confrontation indefinitely. He was wrong. Not because she shouted, not because she retaliated publicly, but because she moved deliberately. And deliberate action, once initiated, does not retreat under pressure. Thursday would formalize what Monday had begun. The illusion of unilateral control had ended. What remained was evidence. Thursday arrived without spectacle. No thunder, no dramatic shift in weather. Manhattan moved as it always did. Subways grinding beneath pavement, delivery trucks, double parked along avenues, executives scanning screens before their first meetings. But in a private conference room at Helixara headquarters, the atmosphere carried a different density. The board meeting had been scheduled weeks earlier to formally review integration timelines following the merger announcement. What had not been listed on the agenda was recalibration of internal perception. Peyton arrived at 8:45 a.m., 15 minutes early. She wore navy again, structured, minimal, unadorned. Her hair pulled back, a leather portfolio tucked beneath her arm. Margaret Harlan sat near the head of the table, reviewing printed materials. Charles Whitman was already present, seated upright, hands folded. Good morning, Peyton said. Morning, Whitman replied, studying her with open acknowledgement now. Not polite curiosity, respect. Eric entered at 8:58 a.m. He had insisted on attending, though technically this meeting fell outside his operational jurisdiction. As Peyton's husband and a minor investor through a separate holding, he had access. He moved with visible restraint, jaw set slightly tighter than usual. No one mentioned the sealed court filing, but word travels in controlled circles. Margaret opened the meeting promptly at 9. First item, she said, integration structure and leadership recognition. The projection screen illuminated with slides, financial modeling summaries, projected market response, stock performance metrics since announcement. The numbers were clear, upward, measured, stabilized. Margaret clicked to the next slide. Negotiation and strategic oversight. Peyton Stephens. Her name filled the screen. Bullet points listed milestones. Initiation of talks 14 months prior, risk mitigation, modeling cross-regulatory compliance alignment, intellectual property retention strategy. Eric shifted slightly in his chair. He had seen versions of this slide deck before, but not framed this way. Not without his name adjacent. Margaret continued. The board wishes to formally recognize Peyton's leadership in securing this transaction. Charles Whitman spoke next. In my 40 years in investment oversight, he said evenly, I have rarely seen negotiations of this scale executed with such restraint and precision. He turned toward Peyton. You understood leverage without overextension. Eric's gaze flickered toward Whitman. Leverage. That word again. Thank you, Peyton replied simply. There was no smile of triumph, only acknowledgement. Margaret advanced to the next slide. Second item, she said carefully, risk exposure assessment. A subtle pause entered the room. On the screen appeared a summary of indirect capital movement flagged during internal review. Silverline Holdings, LLC. Eric's spine stiffened. Margaret did not look at him. As part of routine post-merger audit, she continued, we identified indirect routing of funds originating from structured investment pools connected to this firm. The phrasing was precise, not accusatory, but undeniable. Charles Whitman leaned forward. Explain, he said. Margaret gestured to Peyton. Peyton stood. She did not rush. She did not glance at Eric. Over the past 24 months, she began voice level, $3.2 million were transferred from joint accounts, seeded partially by compensation structures linked to this firm. She advanced the slide. Transaction summaries appeared. Dates, amounts, routing sequences. Funds were layered through an entity known as Silverline Holdings, LLC, she continued. Beneficial control traces to Eric Stephens. Now she looked at him. Not with anger, with confirmation. Eric's mouth opened slightly, but no words emerged immediately. This exposure, Peyton continued, does not currently threaten firm solvency. However, it constitutes undisclosed movement of capital tied to fiduciary responsibility. Silence settled heavily across the table. One board member cleared his throat. Was this authorized? He asked. No, Peyton replied. Eric leaned forward abruptly. This is personal, he said, voice tight. You're conflating marital issues with corporate governance. Margaret's tone remained even. Capital originating from compensation structures linked to this firm is not personal. Eric's eyes flashed. You're overstating exposure. Peyton met his gaze calmly. The documentation is available for independent review. Charles Whitman interjected quietly. Is there evidence of intent? Peyton held his gaze for a fraction of a second. Yes. She did not elaborate further. She did not play the recording. Not here, not yet. Whitman leaned back. Then this requires formal separation of interests, he said. Margaret nodded. Temporary suspension of indirect influence, pending legal clarification. Eric laughed once brittle. You're sidelining me based on speculation. No, Peyton said. On documentation. The word carried weight. Eric's composure began to thin. This is retaliation, he insisted. Because of the filing. No one responded to that. The board members avoided his eyes now, not out of sympathy, out of recalculation, because influence shifts quickly when credibility fractures. Margaret closed the slide deck. Effective immediately, she said, Eric Stephens' advisory access to integration discussions is suspended pending independent review. The language was formal, but the meaning was simple. He was no longer inside the room. Eric stood abruptly. You're making a mistake, he said, scanning faces that no longer mirrored his certainty. Charles Whitman's expression remained neutral. Mistakes occur when oversight fails, Whitman said quietly. This is oversight. Eric looked at Peyton. For the first time, there was something close to recognition in his expression. Not admiration, not affection, recognition of miscalculation. You planned this, he said under his breath. Yes, she answered. He exhaled sharply and left the room without further comment. The door closed behind him with controlled force. Silence lingered for a moment longer. Then business resumed. Margaret summarized next steps: independent forensic audit, compliance review, communication protocols. Peyton sat down. She did not feel victorious. She felt aligned. After the meeting adjourned, Charles Whitman approached her privately. You handled that without spectacle, he said. Spectacle weakens structure, she replied. He studied her carefully. You'll have offers, he said. Beyond this firm. I'm aware, she answered. He nodded once. Don't underestimate the respect you've earned. Respect, not fear, not intimidation. Respect built through documented discipline. Outside, Eric stood near the elevator bank staring at his phone. His assistant had texted twice asking about schedule adjustments. He ignored it. The hallway felt narrower than before. Control had been recalibrated publicly. Not through shouting, through slides, through numbers, through sequence. Peyton exited the boardroom moments later. She walked past him without slowing. He turned. You think this is over? He asked quietly. She paused. No, she said. It's just beginning, not as threat, as fact, because legal proceedings had yet to unfold. Court hearings awaited. Documentation would be examined under oath. The board had recalibrated internal trust, but external consequences remained. Eric watched her walk away. For the first time in 10 years, he was no longer certain the room would follow him. And uncertainty for a man who relied on volume felt like silence. Eric did not come home that night. He sent a single text at 9:14 p.m. staying at the Mercer. We need to talk. Peyton read it while seated at her desk reviewing integration memos. She did not respond immediately. She finished annotating a risk allocation clause first. Then she typed tomorrow. 7 p.m. No punctuation beyond that. The apartment felt unusually still without his presence. Not peaceful, just recalibrated. At 6:52 p.m. the following evening, Eric entered with a keycard he had never needed before. He looked tired, not disheveled, just recalculated. Peyton was seated at the dining table again, a slim folder placed neatly in front of her. She did not stand. He remained near the entryway for a moment, as if uncertain whether to remove his coat. You've made your point, he began. This isn't about points, she replied. He crossed the room and sat opposite her. You embarrassed me in that boardroom. You embarrassed yourself in a ballroom, she said evenly. His jaw tightened. That was a joke. No, she replied. It was belief. Silence stretched between them. You've always needed to be right, he said. I've always needed documentation, she corrected. He leaned back, exhaling. Fine, let's talk documentation. She slid the folder toward him. Inside were printed bank statements, highlighted transaction IDs, a summary sheet. He flipped through the pages quickly at first, then slower. You pulled 2 years, he asked. Yes, this doesn't show context, it shows routing. He set the papers down. Silverline was temporary, he said. Liquidity channel. That's it? Why not disclose, she asked. Because you would have overcomplicated it. She held his gaze. You layered beneficial ownership, she said, through voting agreements. His eyes flickered. That's standard asset structuring? It's concealment when undisclosed, she replied. He ran a hand through his hair. You think I was stealing from you? I think you diverted shared capital without consent. That's not theft. It's breach. He laughed, once frustrated. You're turning marriage into litigation. You turned partnership into hierarchy. The words landed softly, but they did not soften him. You're exaggerating everything, he insisted. 3 million over 2 years is not catastrophic. Scale doesn't determine integrity, she said. He looked at her differently then. You recorded me? He asked again, suspicion rising. No, she said. Melissa did. He closed his eyes briefly. She had no right. You gave her content, Peyton replied. He stood abruptly and paced once across the room. You're going to use that recording in court if necessary. That conversation was strategic brainstorming. It was intense, she said. He turned sharply. You think I plan to remove you? Yes. He stopped pacing. For a moment, something almost vulnerable surfaced in his expression. "You were pulling away," he said more quietly. "I was working," she replied. "You never needed me." "That's not the same as not choosing you." The sentence unsettled him more than accusation would have. He sank back into his chair. "This is about control," he said again, but the conviction had weakened. "It's about alignment," she answered. "You filed without warning." "I asked about routing," she reminded him. It was a warning." He exhaled slowly. "What do you want now?" She folded her hands on the table. "Full disclosure. Immediate cessation of Silver Line transfers. Cooperation with forensic review. Structured separation of assets." "You're not even fighting emotionally," he said, almost incredulous. "What would that accomplish?" she asked. He studied her as if seeing her clearly for the first time in years. "You don't hate me," he said. "No," she replied. The honesty in that answer seemed to disorient him. "I don't hate you," she repeated. "But I won't protect you from consequences." Silence again. "You're really going through with this?" he said. "Yes." He leaned forward. "You'll lose the apartment. I've already signed a lease." He blinked. "Where Hudson Square?" He absorbed that. "You planned all this?" "Yes." "How long?" She considered. "Since the first unexplained transfer." "That was over a year ago?" "Yes." He shook his head slowly. "You've been preparing for divorce for a year. I've been preparing for clarity." He looked down at the folder again. "You think I underestimated you," he said. "You did. And now you're recalculating." He almost smiled despite himself. "You always speak like this, yes." The tension shifted subtly, less volatile, more final. "What about the board?" he asked quietly. "They acted appropriately. You didn't need to expose me there. I needed to protect the firm." He leaned back again, staring at the ceiling briefly. "You could have destroyed me publicly. I didn't. Yet." "I won't," she said. He looked at her sharply. "You're not going to leak anything, no?" "Why?" "Because humiliation isn't corrective." He let that settle. "You really believe that?" "Yes." Another silence. Not charged this time, just reflective. "I thought you were passive," he admitted. "I was patient," she replied. He gave a low, almost humorless laugh. "Turns out that's worse." "No," she said softly. "It's stronger." He stood again, slower now. "So what happens next?" "Temporary orders Thursday," she said. "Then structured mediation. And if I fight, you'll prolong cost." He studied her. "You're calm." "Yes." "Are you ever angry?" She paused. "Yes." No. That answer seemed to affect him more than any raised voice could have. He moved toward the door, then stopped. "For what it's worth," he said without turning. "I didn't think you'd actually leave." "I know," she said. The door closed quietly behind him. Peyton remained seated at the table for several minutes. Not in triumph, in transition. 10 years of partnership had unraveled not through a single argument, but through accumulation, documentation, pattern, intent. She gathered the folder and returned it to her study drawer. Outside, the city moved without noticing their private recalibration. Inside, something had ended. Not explosively, but definitively. Because once respect erodes and concealment replaces transparency, restoration requires more than apology. It requires reconstruction. And she had chosen not to rebuild. The courthouse in Lower Manhattan did not invite drama. Its exterior was austere stone symmetrical windows, heavy doors that absorbed sound rather than amplified it. Inside hallways carried the echo of measured footsteps and quiet legal exchanges. No chandeliers, no string quartets, no curated lighting, only procedure. Peyton arrived at 8:12 a.m., wearing a charcoal suit and low heels. Her hair was tied back, her expression neutral. She carried a single leather portfolio, no entourage, no display. David Klein met her near the security checkpoint. Temporary orders, hearing he reminded her quietly. Asset restraints, preliminary review of fiduciary claims. She nodded once. Eric arrived 10 minutes later with his attorney, a sharp-featured litigator named Thomas Grady. Grady's reputation rested on aggressive cross-examination and strategic intimidation. Eric looked composed, but the tightness around his mouth suggested otherwise. They did not greet each other. Inside the courtroom, the setting was restrained polished wood benches, a raised bench for the judge, the state seal mounted above. Judge Elena Martinez entered at precisely 9. All rise. Voices fell silent as everyone sat. David presented first. He did not dramatize. He did not raise his voice. He submitted documentation. Your Honor, we request temporary protective orders to prevent further diversion of marital assets pending forensic review. Evidence includes documented transfers totaling $3.2 million through a layered entity, Silverline Holdings, LLC. He handed forward printed summaries. Beneficial ownership tracing confirms indirect control by Mr. Stephens. Additionally, we submit recorded evidence indicating intent to conceal transfers and marginalize financial oversight. The word intent shifted the air. Grady rose smoothly. Your Honor, these are business structuring decisions misconstrued as misconduct. No funds have been lost. No insolvency risk exists. Judge Martinez did not react outwardly. Were the transfers disclosed? She asked. Grady hesitated a fraction. Not formally, he admitted, but informal discussions occurred. Judge Martinez looked at Eric. Did you disclose the full structure of Silverline Holdings to your spouse? Eric swallowed. Not in detail. Did funds originate from joint accounts seeded by compensation tied to Miss Stephens's professional role? Yes, he said quietly. And were those funds rerouted without written consent? He hesitated again. Yes. Silence settled. Intent matters in financial governance. Consent matters in marriage. Judge Martinez reviewed the documents before her. Temporary protective orders are granted, she said finally. All further transfers through Silverline Holdings are suspended pending forensic audit. Both parties are to provide full financial disclosure within 10 days. Grady shifted in his seat. Your Honor, the order stands, she said. The gavel struck once, not loud, but final. Outside the courtroom, reporters lingered, not for this case specifically, but because high-profile filings often attracted attention. Word of the sealed petition had begun circulating quietly among financial journalists. One reporter recognized Peyton. Miss Stephens, is this related to the Helix-Sara merger, he called. She did not stop walking. No comment, David answered for her. Eric exited separately. Grady spoke in low, urgent tones beside him. This can still be contained, Grady said. We challenge the recording's admissibility. Eric's jaw tightened. She won't leak it, he said. Grady glanced at him. You're certain, yes. But certainty now felt different, less assumed, more fragile. By afternoon, financial blogs had begun speculating. Unconfirmed reports of internal restructuring connected to Silverline Holdings. Names were not yet public, but patterns draw attention. Peyton returned to her office and closed the door. She opened her laptop and resumed reviewing integration timelines. Work did not pause for personal litigation. Claire knocked softly. You okay? She asked. Yes. Claire studied her. There are rumors. There will be, Peyton said. Do you want a statement prepared? Not yet. She turned back to her screen. Rumors were noise. Documentation was signal. Later that evening, Eric called. She answered. The orders were unnecessary, he said. They were protective, she replied. You're freezing everything. No, she corrected. The court is. He exhaled sharply. You've turned me into a liability. You positioned yourself there. Silence. This will affect Miami financing, he said. Yes, you're willing to risk that I'm unwilling to ignore exposure. He was quiet longer this time. They're asking questions, he admitted finally. Answer them, she said. I can't disclose everything. You should have thought of that earlier. He almost laughed. You don't even sound angry. I'm not. You don't feel anything I feel resolved. That word unsettled him more than accusation would have. You could have destroyed me publicly, he repeated. I'm not interested in destruction, she said. Then what's separation? The word carried weight, not explosive, but definitive. In the days that followed, forensic auditors began reviewing account layers. Subpoenas were drafted for Silverline's internal agreements. Ryan Stevens hired his own counsel. Patterns emerged quickly. Funds had been routed through multiple holding entities before re-entering Miami development accounts. Not illegal in isolation, but problematic without disclosure. Eric's investors grew cautious. Daniel Price requested revised financial statements. Temporary review, Eric insisted during calls. But tone matters, and doubt spreads faster than confidence. Meanwhile, Peyton continued attending board meetings, press briefings, integration calls. Her name appeared in financial columns, not for litigation, but for strategy. The contrast was quiet but visible. One article described her as architect of disciplined growth. Another mentioned internal governance review connected to associated parties. No names, but proximity was implied. Eric read those articles alone at night in the Mercer Hotel. He replayed the ballroom speech in his mind. To knowing your role. He saw now how easily that sentence could be interpreted differently. Role, authority, hierarchy. He had believed public positioning secured dominance. He had not accounted for documentation. Back in Hudson Square, Peyton signed the lease on her new apartment. Move-in scheduled for the following week. No dramatic exit. No confrontation scene, just logistics. Because endings, when structured properly, do not require spectacle. They require paperwork. And the paperwork was accumulating. The temporary order was only the beginning. Forensic review would formalize findings. Mediation would quantify division. And somewhere between numbers and testimony, a decade-long partnership would become case law. Not because she shouted, but because she recorded. The forensic report arrived 11 days after the temporary order. It was 132 pages long. No adjectives, no moral framing, just transaction chains, corporate layering diagrams, and time-stamped internal communications. David Klein reviewed it first. Then he called Peyton. It's conclusive, he said. She did not ask in what direction. She already knew. Silverline was structured specifically to avoid internal compliance flags tied to your compensation vehicles, David continued. The voting agreements gave Eric effective control without public attribution. Funds were reintroduced into leveraged developments. Exposure, she asked, contained for now. But if Miami underperforms, cascading risk increases significantly. She absorbed that. And the recording, she asked, corroborates intent. There was a brief silence. Mediation is tomorrow, David said. Expect resistance. I do. The mediation took place in a private conference suite overlooking the East River. Neutral territory, long table, 4 chairs on each side. No judge, just structured negotiation. Eric arrived with Thomas Grady and a financial advisor. His expression was composed, but something in his posture had shifted. Less expansive, more guarded. Peyton sat beside David Klein, a single folder in front of her. The mediator, an older woman named Judith Rosen, began with formalities. This is an opportunity for resolution, without further public proceedings, she said. We will focus on asset division, indemnification, and timeline. Grady spoke first. My client acknowledges procedural missteps, but disputes characterization of intent, he said smoothly. We propose restoration of transferred funds and preservation of joint assets without reputational escalation. Judith nodded. Miss Stephens David glanced at Peyton. She spoke calmly. Full reimbursement of diverted capital. Immediate dissolution of joint financial structures. Indemnification against any exposure from Miami developments. Retention of intellectual property and merger equity. Eric exhaled sharply. You're stripping everything he said. No, she replied. I'm separating everything. The mediator intervened. Let's address specifics. For 4 hours, they negotiated numbers. Asset valuations, property division, investment accounts, Silverline dissolution. At one point, Eric leaned forward. "You're punishing me," he said. Peyton met his gaze. If I intended punishment, this would look different. He knew she was right. She had not leaked the recording. She had not issued public accusations. She had not weaponized press. Everything remained procedural, contained. That containment more than any headline unsettled him. By late afternoon, framework agreement was drafted. Eric would retain majority stake in Miami properties, along with full liability. Peyton would retain her merger equity structured funds and sole control over her intellectual frameworks. Joint accounts would be dissolved immediately. Silverline would be dismantled under court supervision. Eric signed first. His signature was slower than usual. She signed second. No flourish, no tremor. Judith Rosen closed the folder. "Final hearing scheduled next week for formal decree," she said. Outside the building, Eric paused beside Peyton for the first time without attorneys. "You could have ruined me," he said quietly. "I didn't need to," she replied. He nodded once. "That's what I miscalculated." She did not respond, because miscalculation was not something she needed to confirm. The final court hearing was brief. Judge Martinez reviewed the mediation agreement, confirmed full disclosure, and issued the decree of dissolution. "Marriage dissolved," she said formally. "Asset division approved as negotiated." The gavel struck once. There was no applause, no music, no audience, just conclusion. As they exited the courtroom, reporters lingered again. This time, one called out directly, "Miss Stephens, is the divorce connected to financial misconduct allegations?" She paused briefly, then answered. No comment. Eric kept walking. That evening, Peyton returned to the apartment one final time. Cardboard boxes lined the hallway. Movers had already taken most of her belongings to Hudson Square. The space felt larger, echoed. Eric stood in the kitchen when she entered. Neither spoke immediately. "I read the final audit summary," he said. "Yes, I underestimated the exposure. Yes." He gave a faint and almost rueful smile. "You were right." She set her keys on the counter. This wasn't about being right. What was it about alignment? He studied her. "You never hated me." "No. You just stopped protecting me." "Yes." He looked down at the counter, then back up. "I don't know if I ever understood you," he admitted. "You didn't need to," she replied. "You needed to respect structure." He nodded slowly. "That's the part I failed." She did not disagree. Movers knocked softly at the door, asking if the final boxes were ready. "Yes," she said. She walked through the apartment once more. Bedroom, study, balcony overlooking the Hudson. 10 years of shared space reduced to memory and documentation. Eric remained in the kitchen. "Goodbye, Peyton," he said, as she reached the door. She turned. "Goodbye, Eric." No anger, no tears, just completion. Outside, the city felt unchanged. Traffic, wind off the river, pedestrians absorbed in their own trajectories. She entered the waiting car and closed the door. As it pulled away, she did not look back, because closure does not require backward glances. It requires forward movement. The Hudson Square apartment was smaller but brighter. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed lower Manhattan. Boxes waited to be unpacked. She stepped inside and stood still for a moment. No echoes, no tension, just space. Her phone vibrated. An email from Charles Whitman. Board vote unanimous. Increased equity allocation in recognition of leadership. She read it once, then set the phone down. $900 million secured. $3.2 million reclaimed. Marriage dissolved. Reputation intact. But numbers were not the conclusion. Alignment was. She walked to the window. Below, the river moved steadily toward the harbor. No spectacle, no noise, just direction. The first morning in the Hudson Square apartment began without an alarm. Light entered, gradually filtered through tall windows that overlooked the river and the layered geometry of lower Manhattan. The space was quieter than the previous apartment, not because the city was softer here, but because there were fewer internal echoes. Peyton woke at 5:46 a.m. habit, not anxiety. For a moment, she lay still, registering absence. No second phone vibrating on a nightstand. No muffled conference calls bleeding under a closed office door. No tension disguised as routine. She rose and walked barefoot across hardwood floors, still unfamiliar under her steps. The kitchen was minimal steel glass, a single wooden cutting board. She brewed coffee and stood by the window as the sky shifted from indigo to pale gray. The river moved steadily. It did not hurry. It did not hesitate. It simply moved. Her phone remained face down on the counter. When she finally turned it over, notifications populated the screen. Emails about integration milestones. A message from Claire confirming next week's board presentation. A discreet note from Margaret Harlan, regulatory review complete. No residual exposure. And one message from an unknown number. She opened it. Peyton, it's Melissa. I saw the filing update. I hope you're okay. She typed back, I am. Thank you. No elaboration, no confession. Gratitude was sufficient. By 7:30 a.m., she was dressed and reviewing financial summaries at the dining table, which now doubled as her temporary workspace. The Helix-Zara integration had entered its operational phase, research pipelines, aligning cross-company teams, merging capital allocation schedules, executing precisely as modeled. Her name appeared on internal memos not as adjunct, but as architect. At 9:12 a.m., Charles Whitman called. Settling in, he asked. Yes. I wanted to reiterate the board's position, he continued. Your equity expansion isn't symbolic. It reflects trust. I understand. There's talk, he added carefully, about offering you a permanent strategic leadership seat. She considered that. Send details, she said. He laughed lightly. Direct as always. Clarity saves time, she replied. After the call ended, she sat quietly for a moment. 10 years earlier, she had entered marriage believing partnership meant shared trajectory. Now she understood something more precise. Partnership requires shared integrity. Without it, alignment fractures. She did not resent Eric. Resentment requires emotional investment. What she felt instead was recalibrated understanding. Later that afternoon, she walked along the river path below her building. Wind lifted her hair slightly. The city pulsed around her, indifferent but alive. Two young professionals passed by discussing startup valuations. A couple argued quietly near a bench. A runner checked his smartwatch. Life unfolded without commentary. Her phone vibrated once. Eric. She let it ring twice before answering. Yes, I received confirmation of Silver Line dissolution, he said. Yes, they're auditing Miami financing. That's appropriate. Silence. I wanted to say something, he added. She waited. I misjudged you. She did not respond immediately. I thought silence meant acceptance. He continued. It didn't. No, she said. Another pause. You didn't destroy me, he said quietly. That wasn't the objective. I know. The wind moved across the river. I hope you build something durable, she said finally. He exhaled faintly. You already did. She ended the call without further comment, not out of cruelty, out of completion. That evening, she unpacked the last box from her study. Inside lay the leather-bound notebook she had kept over the years. She opened it to the first entries. Dates, phrases, moments, patterns. She did not feel bitterness reading them, only recognition. Documentation had not been an act of revenge. It had been preservation of clarity. She closed the notebook and placed it in a drawer. Not as evidence anymore, as archive. At 8:17 p.m., she stepped onto the balcony. The city lights shimmered across water. Somewhere behind her, emails continued arriving. Markets shifted. Decisions were made in rooms she had yet to enter. Power did not announce itself loudly. It accumulated. It stabilized. It endured. She thought briefly of the ballroom. Crystal chandeliers, polite laughter, to knowing your role. He had intended that sentence as diminishment. But roles do evolve. And sometimes evolution requires departure. She had not raised her voice. She had not retaliated publicly. She had not humiliated him in return. Because humiliation erodes credibility. Documentation builds it. The difference between noise and authority is discipline. Inside her phone buzzed again. A message from Claire Integration ahead of schedule. Investors thrilled. She typed back, "Maintain measured pacing." Measured, always measured. She stood there a while longer watching boats cut quiet lines across the river. 10 years had ended. $900 million had been secured. 3.2 million had been documented and reclaimed. But none of those figures defined the moment fully. What defined it was steadiness. She turned and went back inside. The apartment lights glowed softly. No spectacle, no audience. Just space reclaimed. Tomorrow would bring more negotiations, more board calls, more strategy. But tonight, she allowed stillness. Because sometimes the strongest exit is not dramatic. It is dignified. And dignity does not need applause. In the end, what changed was not simply the balance of money or the direction of influence. What changed was alignment. Peyton Stephens never shouted. She never exposed secrets to embarrass. She never retaliated in public for a public humiliation. Instead, she documented. She verified. She moved when the sequence was complete. There is a difference between silence born of fear and silence chosen for strategy. One erodes, the other builds. Eric believed control was measured by volume, by who held the microphone, who commanded the room, who shaped the narrative in front of witnesses. But rooms change, audiences recalibrate, and narratives collapse when unsupported by fact. Documentation, on the other hand, does not rush. It accumulates quietly until structure shifts beneath those who underestimate it. Peyton did not win by destroying him. She walked away with her reputation intact, her work respected, and her future unburdened by concealment. That is not revenge. That is restoration. If you've stayed with this story to the end, you understand something deeper than spectacle. You understand that dignity can be deliberate, that strength does not always announce itself, and that sometimes the most powerful response to humiliation is alignment with truth. If this story resonated with you, then let me know where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. I read those messages more carefully than you might think. And if you believe quiet strength matters in a noisy world, consider subscribing, not for drama, but for stories where integrity, patience, and documentation shape the ending.